Alright, well, God's Not Dead 2 isn't the only film that I saw last week at NRB. I also saw a film called The Insanity of God, and I thought that I would tell you guys about that film too, since I saw it before anybody else ever got to see it. Alright, so The Insanity of God is a documentary film about a missionary named Nick Ripken and his wife. The film begins with them telling their story, how they met, how they became missionaries to Africa, and how he decided he was going to pursue the stories that you end up hearing in the film. See, while he was a missionary in Africa, he went to one of the poorest, most oppressed countries on the continent. And while he was there, he saw some crazy, horrible stuff. He saw people who were Christians willingly die for their faith, and it changed him, it affected him, and it made him realize that going to Africa and telling people about Jesus and helping them wasn't enough. And to me, it seemed to make him question his faith as well, because he had grown up in America and it never was a problem for him. And after some other events happen to him, he realizes he needs to do some research. So he decides he's going to research and pursue interviews with people who have actually lived under oppressive governments as Christians. So the film proceeds to tell the stories of many of these people who he interviewed. And it's amazing. It's really fascinating. Whether you're a Christian or not, these stories are compelling. It's people who lived in Soviet Russia, communist China, in the Middle East. It's so fascinating to hear the stories of people whose faith seem to be absolutely real. Whenever put under the test of oppression, one guy, he's thrown in jail just because he's a Christian, and he wasn't allowed to have a Bible in there, so he writes out as many Bible verses that he could remember, and when the guards find out, they beat him. This is serious persecution. It was really interesting to hear these stories, and it was quite the contrast after having just seen the film God's Not Dead 2, aka Melissa Joan Hart sits around looking like a sad puppy dog, to seeing this. They're not using the government to fight against the government in order to continue to work for the government like the girl in God's Not Dead. These are people who, just because they owned a Bible, had soldiers come into their house and rip them away from their families and hurt them, and people living in fear of their lives. If I had something to complain about with the film, it would probably be that the entire film is told from the perspective of this one guy. We don't actually get to hear the interviewees talk. We only get to hear this missionary retell the stories. It did imply throughout the whole film that he taped all of his interviews with these people who were oppressed, but we never get to hear those stories directly from the horse's mouth, figuratively speaking, of course. Another problem I would have is that I feel like the film doesn't really understand the way that Americans will take some of the recommendations or conclusions that the guy comes to after hearing these stories. I think some Americans will watch the film and say, there, look at that oppression, that's what's gonna happen if we don't get a Christian in office right away. To me, I look at the film and I realize that there's people who are suffering and they're being oppressed by the government. Why would we, as Christians, want to oppress others using that same force? Being a small government-minded person, this maybe is where I immediately think. The other thing that I think Christians will misunderstand is Nick Ripken's conclusion essentially is that us as Americans shouldn't be afraid to share our faith because there are people who aren't afraid to share their faith in other countries who have it far worse than we do. And I thought a lot about this because I thought, what is it about this that I would disagree with? I mean, that sounds like a good idea, right? Oftentimes, I think Americans hear being bold in your faith as being aggressive and rude to people that you don't know. You see, there's a difference between being rude to somebody and being open and honest with someone. Some people even go as far as to feel guilty about having an instinct to not be rude to people in public. Because that inclination to not be rude to somebody you don't know is a good one, and you shouldn't lose that. But that inclination to not tell your friend what God's doing in your life because you're afraid he might think you're not cool, well, that's just you being self-conscious and dishonest. That's something that you need to fight. But the other thing, well, that's just tact. That's something that Christians need to keep. Here's an illustration that might drive home my point. Take kissing, for example. So you shouldn't just go up and kiss people that you don't know. That's not very tactful. However, if you're married, you should probably kiss your spouse. That's good. There's a time and a place for everything. So if we're being overly aggressive, that's not what it means to be bold in your faith. The stories of the people in this film are about people who truly connect with others, and they're being told by their oppressive government that they're not allowed to do that. Their freedoms are being taken away. Again, a very different situation than what's happening in the United States. In the end, yeah, I recommend the film. It's pretty good. Even if you're not a Christian, it's really fascinating to hear these people's stories. I would give it a 71. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this episode. Did you see Insanity of God? Well then, let me know what you think in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. Hey, big shout out to Brendan Neely because he gives $50 a month to my Patreon, patreon.com/saygoodnightkev. That's all I gotta say for today. Got a new movie night coming out in the next few weeks, so that's gonna be exciting. Talk to you later. Good night.